Welcome back to Holiness to the Lord, and this time I'll be covering Genesis chapters 2 and 3. Jumping right in, Genesis 2 verses 4 through 5 talks about how God created every plant before it was on the earth. This to me shows a very good allusion to the idea of a spiritual creation and a physical creation, that there was a plan in place and that there are these two main aspects to everything from plants and animals to mankind. Keep that in mind. Going on to verse 6, there's a footnote in King James that talks about a mist covering the earth, but the Hebrew version is more about being flooded or the earth being covered with water, which is a cool analogy, cool allusion to baptism and ordinances, which I like, either through the cleansing aspect of getting ready for mankind or otherwise. Verse 8, we've got the garden was eastward. East is the direction of the rising sun. The sun provides life and light to the world, and Christ is also referred to as the light and life of the world. East is a significant direction metaphorically. And then verse 10, I think this is a cool detail. The river that flows out of the Garden of Eden to the surrounding area, and it splits into four heads. So if it flows out of the Garden of Eden, that suggests that Eden is at a higher elevation than the parts around it. So it's a hill or a mountain, temple, and the river splitting into four heads, it's metaphorical. The number 4, like the four corners of the earth, the four winds, it's going everywhere. It's filling the earth. So if Eden is a temple and the living waters are flowing out of the temple and covering the whole earth, I think that's a pretty cool thing. In verse 15, it talks about how man is there to dress and care for the garden. This seems very much like an allusion to the priests in the tabernacle in the Old Testament, that there are workers there, temple workers, if you will, who care for, maintain, and do the things needed for the temple or tabernacle. Also, I think it's interesting in verses 16 and 17 how God says, you can freely eat of all of these fruits, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you may not freely eat, but it's given to them to choose. And I feel like this is very much in line with saying that of all these other trees, there are no consequences for you to eat. You are good to do whatever. But God ties a consequence to the tree of knowledge of good and evil and distinctly says, in the day you eat, you shall surely die. Verse 18 says, it is not good for man to be alone. And I think this is a really cool callback to the idea that throughout the creation, the day would finish and God would say, this is good, this is good. When he got to man's creation, this is very good. And in the same way, how things were good in order to get the earth to a point that the plan could move forward. It was functionally good. It was fulfilling its purpose. It is not good for man to be alone. Functionally, for the plan, mankind needs to exist. Children need to be had. That is part of the plan. So it is good for husband and wife to be together. In verse 20, Adam names all the animals, which is really cool because it reinforces the idea of Adam being a steward over the earth, having dominion over all the animals. He names them so they are known to him, and he has responsibility for how they are treated, how they are kept to a great extent, that it's just part of his stewardship. Verse 22 is very interesting because it outlines the creation of man, which, if you go back to chapter 1 already talked about man being created. And so this second iteration of telling how man was created really hits home to me the idea, going back to the beginning of this chapter, that there's a spiritual creation and a physical creation. Genesis specifically mentions the creation of man twice, and so there's this duality aspect, this spiritual and physical, which when we get into chapter 3, starting in verse 4, I think really makes Satan's deception make a lot more sense. Because Satan says, When you eat, you will not surely die. And it all depends on what kind of death he was talking about. The scriptures refer to spiritual death, which is being cut off from the presence of the Lord. And there is physical death, which, we all get what physical death is. And so was Satan wanting them to, if we look in Alma chapter 12, verse 23, Alma is talking about how Satan's plan was to have Adam and Eve go after eating of the tree, the knowledge of good and evil, and go directly back to the tree of life and particular fruit, so that way they wouldn't be able to die physically and they live forever in their sins and they would just kind of be stuck. So Satan could be alluding to that, where he says, you won't surely die, saying, like, if you follow my plan, everything will work out how I want it to, and you'll eat of this fruit, eat of that fruit, and you won't die. Or Satan could be talking about how you won't surely die, like you're not going to die physically right now, but he obviously knew that there was a spiritual death involved. So there's a lot of things that you could read into that if you wanted, and those are just my thoughts. In verse 8 of chapter 3, it talks about how God was walking in the garden. And this reminds me of Isaiah chapter 2, where it talks about the mountain of the Lord and how we will go up, we will learn of his ways, we will walk in his paths. The Lord walking in a space is very much reminiscent of the temple, of the tabernacle, of the presence of the Lord, again reinforcing that the Garden of Eden was the first temple. And then we jump over to verse 21, and it talks about how God clothes Adam and Eve. And here are just a couple of scriptures that I have noted talking about clothing in the scriptures. In Psalms 104, talks about how people are clothed with honor and majesty, specifically God clothed in honor and majesty, and how he covers himself with a garment who stretches out the heavens like a curtain. Just that idea of covering, and how it's directly associated with God, his honor and majesty. It's really interesting because God is the one who clothes his children. Going on to Isaiah 61:10, it talks about how God clothed Isaiah in the garments of salvation and covered me with a robe of righteousness. Again, really, really interesting things, that the allusions to being clothed by the Lord in other parts of Scripture aren't a shameful thing, aren't Adam and Eve done messed up and they need to feel horrible for what they did. It's a very positive thing. And also in 2 Nephi 9:14, we have talking about the last day where the righteous will have a perfect knowledge of all of their righteousness, they having been clothed with purity and a robe of righteousness. Again, going back to that, how being clothed by God is viewed as a very positive thing. And finally, in verse 24, they are driven east. So God placed Garden of Eden eastward, and then when they leave, they are driven east, again driven towards the sun, towards the source of light and truth. So even though Adam and Eve transgressed, I feel like this is very obviously showing that God doesn't think that they are beyond help, doesn't think that it was the end-all be-all worst thing that ever happened. He sends them east in a very metaphorically positive way. And also I find it interesting that cherubim, or cherubim, I think is closer to the Hebrew pronunciation, but don't quote me on that, replace Adam and Eve. The word cherubim, how we say it in English, cherubim is like Elohim. It's a plural word in Hebrew, and from what I understand, cherubim in Hebrew text always comes in pairs. So I think it's interesting that after Adam and Eve, the caretakers of the garden, leave, God places angelic caretakers in their spot to guard and keep safe the garden. So those are my thoughts, and I hope to see you next time.